On a cold, silent night, Big Shaq stumbles upon an abandoned baby on the steps of a church, wrapped in a scorched blanket, with a chilling note. They are coming. What starts as an act of kindness spirals into a deadly chase, uncovering a dark experiment and a hidden war. As Shaq fights to protect the child, he realizes this baby isn't just in danger. He's the key to something far more terrifying. But the real horror? The experiment isn't over. And now, they're hunting Shaq too. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the fireplace. The wind outside howled through the dense trees, a reminder of just how isolated they were. Big Shaq sat at the small wooden table, staring down at his hands, his mind replaying everything that had led them here. The firelight flickered across the faces of his companions. Sienna, seated across from him, her fingers tapping away at her laptop, and Elijah, bundled in thick blankets on the couch, his tiny chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. It had only been a week since the explosion at the Hawthorne facility, the night they thought they had ended Project Seraphim once and for all. But nothing ever ended that cleanly. Jonathan Hawthorne was dead, but the project wasn't. Someone had stepped in to continue his twisted legacy. Shaq's fists clenched at the memory of Dante's betrayal, a man he once trusted, who had turned against them to protect his own secrets. Dante had thought he could make a deal with Hawthorne to save someone he loved, but in the end, he had been a pawn. And now he was dead. Sienna exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples as she scanned the latest reports. They're saying Hawthorne's estate has been frozen, his assets seized, but the government's refusing to investigate Project Seraphim. They're saying it died with him. Shaq scoffed. That's bull. If the project was really dead, we wouldn't still be running. Sienna hesitated. There's more. Shaq looked up, catching the flicker of something in her expression. Hesitation, maybe even fear. She turned the screen toward him. A new name had surfaced in connection to Hawthorne's work. Langford Pierce. Shaq frowned. Who the hell is Langford? Sienna swallowed. He's worse than Hawthorne. Shaq let that sink in. Worse. Before he could press further, a weak cough from the couch made him turn. Elijah was getting sicker. His small body trembled under the blankets, his skin pale and clammy. Shaq moved to his side, pressing a hand to the boy's forehead. His temperature was burning hot one moment and ice cold the next. It had been happening more frequently, and Shaq had no explanation for it. He's not getting better, Shaq murmured. Sienna closed her laptop, guilt shadowing her face. I've been looking into it. His DNA, it's not normal. His body is reacting to something, but I don't know what. Shaq's gut twisted. Elijah wasn't just any child. He had been created for something, and if they didn't figure out what was happening to him soon, they might lose him. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Shaq tensed, reaching for his gun. No one was supposed to know they were here. Sienna's eyes widened. We didn't trigger any signals. No one should have been able to track us. Shaq motioned for her to stay put, then crept toward the door. He peered through the peephole and froze. A man stood on the porch, tall and lean, his silver hair catching the moonlight. His eyes were sharp, calculating, but his expression was unreadable. He didn't look like a soldier or a government agent, but something about him sent alarms ringing in Shaq's head. The man knew exactly where he was, and worse, he wasn't afraid. Shaq gritted his teeth and slowly opened the door, keeping his gun hidden at his side. You got 5 seconds to tell me who you are and why I shouldn't put you on the ground, Shaq growled. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he gave a slow, measured smile. My name is Silas Kane, and I'm here to save your life. Shaq didn't lower his weapon. That so? Silas nodded, his gaze flicking past Shaq toward the couch where Elijah lay. Because if you don't listen to me right now, that boy is going to die. The words sent an icy shiver down Shaq's spine. He stepped aside reluctantly, allowing Silas to enter. Sienna's eyes darted between them, clearly uneasy. Who is this? Silas met her gaze. Someone who knows exactly what you're running from. Shaq folded his arms. You've got 2 minutes. Start talking. Silas took a slow breath before speaking. Hawthorne was never the real mastermind behind Project Seraphim. He was just a front, a face for the public. The real architect of the experiment is Langford Pierce, and now that Hawthorne is gone, he's taken full control. Shaq's jaw tightened. So why are you here? Silas's expression darkened. Because Project Seraphim isn't dead. It's evolving, and Elijah is proof of that. Shaq exchanged a glance with Sienna before looking back at Silas. Keep talking, Shaq muttered. Silas stepped closer, lowering his voice. Elijah was never meant to survive outside the program. His body was designed to adapt, but without the right conditions, he's deteriorating. If you don't get him help soon, his body will shut down. Shaq's stomach twisted. And let me guess, you just happen to know someone who can help. Silas nodded. But there's a price. You need to help me find Aurora. Silas's words sent a shockwave through the room. Sienna's breath caught. Aurora? Shaq narrowed his eyes. Who the hell is Aurora? Silas's voice was grim. The first child of Project Seraphim, the one who came before Elijah. And if we don't find her soon, Langford Pierce will. A heavy silence filled the room. Shaq looked down at Elijah, his small form curled up in the blankets, barely breathing. He didn't trust Silas. But if there was even a chance that this Aurora girl could save Elijah, he had no choice. Shaq exhaled, his decision made. Where do we start? Silas's lips curled into a knowing smile. We start by going back to where it all began. And just like that, the hunt for Aurora began. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The only sounds came from the occasional rustle of tree branches in the wind and the distant hoot of an owl. Shaq sat on the porch of the remote cabin, his gaze fixed on the dark forest beyond. His gut told him something was off. For days he had felt a presence lurking in the shadows, a sensation that someone was watching them. He had written it off as paranoia, until tonight. A twig snapped. Shaq tensed, reaching for his gun. He didn't move, his eyes scanning the darkness. Then, like a ghost emerging from the night, a figure stepped forward. The man was tall and lean, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His silver-streaked hair gave him an air of authority, but it was the way he carried himself, calm, calculating, that made Shaq uneasy. You should really be more careful, the man said in a low, measured voice. You're not as hidden as you think. Shaq cocked the gun, aiming straight at the man's chest. You got about 5 seconds to tell me who you are before I put you in the ground. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly, his hands raised slightly in mock surrender. The name's Silas Kane, and if you shoot me, you'll never get the answers you need. Shaq studied him, his instincts on high alert. He had met killers, liars, and manipulators before. Silas looked like he might be all three. What answers? Shaq asked, his voice flat. Silas took a slow step forward, his gaze flicking toward the cabin. The boy, Elijah. You think you saved him from Hawthorne, but the project didn't die with him. Shaq's grip on the gun tightened. What do you know about it? Silas exhaled, lowering his hands. Everything, because I was a part of it. Inside the cabin, Sienna's fingers froze over her laptop keyboard. She had been tracking the cabin's security feeds when she saw Shaq speaking to the stranger. She turned up the volume, her brows knitting together as she listened. Silas's voice was steady. Project Seraphim was never about one child. Elijah wasn't the first success. Shaq frowned. What do you mean? Silas folded his arms. Before Elijah, there was another, a girl named Aurora, the first child to survive the experiment. But unlike Elijah, her enhancements were never erased. She's out there, Shaq, and she's in danger. A chill ran down Shaq's spine. Where is she? Silas's jaw tightened. That's the problem. Nobody knows. She escaped the facility years ago, vanished without a trace. But now Langford Pierce is hunting her. And if he finds her before we do. He let the sentence hang. Shaq didn't need it spelled out. Aurora wasn't just another experiment. She was the key to everything. Sienna, still listening from inside, went pale at the mention of Langford Pierce. She had heard that name before. years ago, back when she was working in cyber forensics, digging into classified government programs. Langford Pierce wasn't just a scientist. He was a shadow, a man who operated in the darkest corners of military research. Cold, methodical, merciless. And now, he was after Elijah. Shaq noticed Sienna's expression when he stepped back inside. "What is it?" Sienna hesitated, then closed her laptop. "Langford Pierce. I've seen his name before." Shaq's eyes narrowed. "You know something." Sienna exhaled. "Not enough, but enough to know he's worse than Hawthorne ever was." Silas stepped inside, standing just beyond the doorway, his presence like a storm cloud. "That's why we need to find Aurora first. Because if Langford gets to her, he won't just restart Project Seraphim." He met Shaq's gaze. "He'll perfect it." A heavy silence filled the room. Shaq looked down at Elijah, sleeping fitfully on the couch. His body was already changing. They were running out of time. Shaq turned back to Silas, his jaw set. "Then tell me where we start." Silas's lips curled into a knowing smile. "We start by going back to where it all began." The air inside the cabin was thick with tension. Shaq stood with his arms crossed, his eyes locked on Silas, who had just dropped a bombshell that changed everything. And she wasn't just some lost experiment. She was Dante's biological daughter. Shaq's fists clenched at the thought. Was this why Dante had betrayed them? Had he been working both sides the entire time to protect her? Sienna sat by the table, typing furiously on her laptop, pulling up files, blueprints, anything that could confirm Silas's claims. Her voice was tight when she spoke. "He's not lying. I found a match. There's an orphanage listed under a dummy charity fund, completely off the grid. No real records, no official funding. But look at this." She turned the screen toward Shaq and Silas. On the satellite image, buried deep in the woods, was a facility disguised as an orphanage. High fences, guard towers, armed patrols. "That's not an orphanage," Shaq muttered. "That's a prison." Silas nodded grimly. "That's where they're keeping Aurora. And if Langford's running things now, she doesn't have much time." Shaq exhaled sharply, his mind racing. He had no love left for Dante after the betrayal, but if there was even a chance that he was being played, if Dante had been forced to make a terrible choice to protect his daughter, then this was bigger than just revenge. Aurora needed to be saved. The plan came together fast. Silas had blueprints of the orphanage's underground levels. Sienna hacked the security grid, finding a blind spot in the surveillance cameras. They'd have exactly 7 minutes to slip inside before the system rebooted. Shaq adjusted the strap of his tactical vest. He was built for this kind of mission, but sneaking into enemy territory wasn't his style. He preferred breaking through walls and taking out threats head-on. But tonight, they had to be ghosts. Under the cover of darkness, the team moved toward the facility. Shaq took point, Silas covered the rear, and Sienna guided them through earpieces, watching the security feeds. They reached the back entrance where 2 guards stood at attention. Shaq moved fast, silent. One punched to the throat, another to the temple. Both men dropped before they even knew what hit them. Silas smirked. Still got it. They slipped inside. The inside of the orphanage was eerily quiet. Too quiet. There were no sounds of children, no caretakers, just cold hallways and rows of locked doors. Shaq's gut told him something was off. "This ain't an orphanage," he muttered. "This is a damn testing facility." Down in the basement, they found her. Aurora. She was 12 years old, frail, but her piercing silver eyes burned with something unnatural. She was strapped to a hospital bed, monitors hooked up to her small frame. The sight made Shaq's stomach turn. He rushed forward, unclipping the restraints. "We got you, kid." Aurora didn't flinch. She just stared at him. "You're late," she whispered. Shaq froze. "What?" Aurora sat up slowly, rubbing her wrists where the restraints had been. "He told me you'd come. He told me to wait." Shaq's blood ran cold. Something was wrong. The second he turned, he heard the voice he never wanted to hear again. Shaq. Standing in the doorway, gun in hand, was Dante. Shaq's entire body tensed as he faced Dante, memories of their last betrayal hitting him like a freight train. "You sold us out again?" Shaq growled, fists clenched. Dante's face was unreadable, but there was pain in his eyes. "I had no choice." Shaq took a step closer. "You always have a choice, Dante." Dante exhaled sharply. "You don't understand. I gave up Elijah because I thought it would get Aurora out. Langford promised me." Shaq shook his head. "And you believed him? After everything?" Dante's gaze flickered to Aurora, then back to Shaq. "I didn't think I had another option." Aurora suddenly spoke. "He's lying." The room went still. Shaq turned to her. "What?" Aurora's silver eyes locked onto Dante's. "He knew Langford wasn't going to let me go. He knew this was a trap." Shaq's chest tightened. "Is that true?" Dante hesitated just a second too long. Then, the alarms blared. Shaq's stomach dropped. They had walked right into a setup. The doors behind Dante burst open, and Langford's men stormed in. Rifles raised, trained, ready. Shaq grabbed Aurora, shielding her behind him. Silas reached for his gun, but there were too many. Then Langford Pierce walked in, tall, cold. The kind of man who didn't raise his voice because he never had to. He glanced at Dante, then at Shaq, and smirked. "Thank you for bringing me exactly what I needed," Langford said smoothly. Shaq's rage burned hot. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Shaq muttered. Langford's smirk widened. "Who said I won't?" And just like that, the trap was sprung. The darkest hour, trapped and outnumbered, 1,000 words. The fight for survival. The moment the alarm blared, chaos erupted. Shaq moved on instinct, grabbing Aurora and pushing her behind cover as Langford's elite soldiers stormed the room. Red laser sights danced through the darkness. Dante hesitated for half a second before pulling his gun. His loyalty had been broken, but for now, he was fighting with Shaq. "Stay down!" Shaq barked at Aurora before throwing himself into the fight. Gunfire exploded in the air, bullets ricocheting off metal and glass. Shaq dodged left, taking down one soldier with a brutal uppercut before grabbing the rifle from another and slamming it into his ribs. Dante was lethal and precise, shooting down 2 guards before diving for cover. His movements were smooth, practiced. This wasn't just about survival anymore. Aurora peeked out from behind a desk. Her silver eyes flashed. And then, something eerie happened. Shaq was about to lunge at a soldier when Aurora whispered, "Duck!" His instincts kicked in, and he obeyed. A bullet whizzed over his head, barely missing him. "What the hell?" Shaq muttered. Aurora looked at him, dead serious. "I can see it before it happens." She was predicting the future. Shaq barely had time to process it before another wave of soldiers rushed in. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was survival. Just as Shaq took down another soldier, a slow clap echoed through the room. Langford Pierce stepped inside, calm, composed. The kind of man who didn't need to yell to be terrifying. "Impressive," he mused, looking around at the wreckage. "But let's be honest, you were never going to win this fight." Shaq clenched his fists, rage burning hot. "Then come take me yourself." Langford chuckled. "I don't need to. This was never about you." He turned his gaze to Aurora. "You are remarkable," Langford murmured. "The others failed, but you? You are the blueprint." Aurora glared at him. "I'm not yours." Langford smirked. "Oh, but you are. Everything you are belongs to me." Shaq felt his blood run cold. This wasn't about making super soldiers. This was about absolute control. Aurora wasn't just an experiment. She was a prototype. And if Langford won, he'd build an army just like her. Langford snapped his fingers. His men raised their rifles. "Kill them all," he ordered. Gunfire erupted. Dante lunged forward, not away, but toward Aurora. He grabbed her and shielded her with his own body. Bullets tore into him. 1, 2, 3. He gasped, blood splattering onto the floor. Shaq's roar shook the room. "No!" Aurora screamed, trying to hold Dante up as he collapsed. His breaths were ragged, shallow, his blood soaked through her small hands. He looked up at her, his expression pained but peaceful. I tried. I tried to keep you safe, he whispered. I'm sorry, kid. Aurora sobbed, shaking her head. Don't leave me. Dante's gaze flickered to Shaq. Take care of her, he rasped. And then, his eyes went still. Aurora let out a heartbreaking cry. Her entire body trembled with rage and sorrow. Shaq felt something shift in the air. Aurora's silver eyes burned brighter than ever. And suddenly, the entire room felt heavier. Langford took a step back, his smirk faltering. She's activating, he whispered. Aurora's breath came in sharp gasps. The lights above flickered. The ground trembled. And then, all hell broke loose. A shockwave burst from her body, sending guards flying across the room. The air rippled with an unseen force, power unlike anything Shaq had ever felt before. Langford's men tried to shoot, but their bullets curved away from her, as if repelled by an invisible barrier. Shaq pulled Aurora back. Kid, we gotta go. But Aurora's eyes stayed locked on Langford. You took my mother, she said, her voice cold. You made me a prisoner. Langford's expression finally showed fear. Aurora lifted her hand. The air around Langford distorted. His body jerked as if pulled by invisible strings. Shaq had no idea what she was doing, but it was killing him. Langford gasped, clutching at his throat, his feet lifting off the ground. Shaq grabbed her wrist. Aurora, enough! Her eyes snapped to him. And just like that, the power vanished. Langford dropped to the floor, coughing violently. He looked shaken but alive. Aurora's entire body sagged. Her hands trembled. Shaq scooped her up, his grip tight. We're leaving. Silas, who had been pinned under debris, staggered forward, shaking his head in disbelief. That was impossible. Shaq didn't care. He just knew they had to move. Where's Sienna? He asked. Silas frowned. She disappeared as soon as the shooting started. Shaq's stomach twisted with unease. That's when Langford, still gasping for breath, said something that turned Shaq's blood to ice. You've done well, Agent Cross. Shaq froze. His head turned slowly. Langford was smiling, because standing in the shadows, completely unharmed, was Sienna. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look scared. She looked guilty. Shaq's heart pounded in his ears. Langford chuckled, wiping blood from his lips. You didn't think she was really on your side, did you? Shaq felt sick. Sienna had been working for them all along. The air in the underground facility was thick with tension, charged with something unnatural. Shaq stood across from Langford, his body aching from battle, his mind reeling from Sienna's betrayal. His fists clenched at his sides, fury burning in his chest. Aurora stood beside him, her silver eyes glowing with raw, untamed power. Langford smirked, dusting off his suit. Well, I expected a fight, but this is entertainment. His gaze flicked to Aurora. The prodigal daughter awakens. Aurora's breath was unsteady, rage simmering just beneath the surface. Dante was dead, her only family gone in an instant. Shaq took a step forward. This ends here, Langford. Langford chuckled. Oh, Shaq. You still think this is a fight? This was never about who's stronger. It's about control. With a flick of his wrist, hidden turrets activated in the ceiling, red dots locking onto them. Armed guards poured into the room. Shaq's stomach dropped. They were outnumbered. Langford turned to Aurora. Come with me and they live. Aurora stared at him, her small hands trembling. Shaq whispered, Kid, don't listen to him. Langford's smirk deepened. You can't stop this, Shaq. You never could. Then something shifted. A pulse rippled through the air, cold, electric, unnatural. Aurora's eyes flashed silver. The room flickered. The monitors, the turrets, the security cameras, all powered down. For a second, there was silence. Then a deafening explosion rocked the facility. The emergency lights sputtered to life, casting eerie red glows across the walls. Shaq looked down at Aurora. She had shut it all down. Langford's expression finally cracked. No, he whispered. That's impossible. Aurora lifted her gaze, her voice steady, but ice cold. You should have let me go. The guards hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Their weapons were useless now. Shaq saw his moment. He charged. Shaq versus Langford. The fight was brutal. Shaq's massive frame moved with deadly precision, blocking Langford's strikes before countering with bone-shattering force. Langford was fast. Too fast for a normal man. His body had been enhanced, just like Aurora's. But Shaq had something Langford didn't. Experience. A brutal left hook sent Langford staggering back, blood spraying from his nose. But then, Langford laughed. Do you really think this is about strength? He sneered, wiping his face. You still don't understand. Shaq tensed. Something was wrong. Langford pulled a syringe from his pocket, filled with an ominous glowing serum. Aurora's eyes widened in horror. No, don't! Langford plunged it into his own neck. His body convulsed. A guttural growl ripped from his throat. His veins turned black, his pupils dilating into slits. Shaq barely had time to react before Langford moved, faster than humanly possible. A fist slammed into Shaq's ribs, sending him flying across the room, crashing into a steel pillar. The impact rattled his bones. Langford grinned through sharpened teeth. Now let's finish this. Sienna's redemption. Sienna had been standing frozen, watching. But something in her eyes shifted as she looked at Aurora, at the child she had betrayed. Then she looked at Langford, the monster she had been working for, and for the first time she realized she had chosen the wrong side. Langford was about to strike Shaq again when, bang! Sienna shot Langford in the leg. He howled, staggering back. I'm done taking orders, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Shaq used the distraction. He pushed off the pillar, launched forward, and tackled Langford to the ground. The two men grappled, but Langford's strength was inhuman now. His hands wrapped around Shaq's throat, crushing the air from his lungs. Shaq saw his vision darkening. Then, Aurora stepped forward. Langford's fate. Erased. Shaq barely registered it at first. Aurora's hands lifted. Her silver eyes darkened, flickering with something inhuman. Langford's body froze. His breathing hitched. His pupils dilated wildly. Then he screamed. It wasn't just pain. It was terror. Aurora was inside his mind, and she was wiping him clean. Langford convulsed, his fingers clawing at his own head as if trying to hold on to something. His voice turned ragged. No, Aurora's whisper was soft but final. Goodbye. And then, Langford collapsed. Alive, but empty. His mind was gone. Shaq coughed, gasping for air as he stumbled to his feet. His gaze flickered to Langford's motionless body. Aurora stood over him, her small hands still trembling. Shaq placed a hand on her shoulder. It's over. Aurora looked up at him, eyes glossy with unshed tears. Then why does it still hurt? Shaq didn't have an answer. Sienna exhaled shakily. We need to go before reinforcements arrive. Shaq nodded. He turned to Aurora, his voice softer now. You with me, kid? Aurora hesitated, then took his hand. And together, they walked away. The underground facility burned behind them, thick smoke curling into the night sky like the ghosts of the past. The air reeked of scorched metal and shattered dreams. Shaq gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his muscles coiled with tension. In the back seat, Aurora sat stiffly, staring out of the window, her silver eyes reflecting the orange glow of the flames. She hadn't spoken since Langford collapsed. Beside her, baby Elijah stirred in his car seat, whimpering softly. His tiny fingers curled and uncurled, his breathing erratic. Shaq noticed. Something was wrong with him. Sienna sat in the passenger seat, silent. The weight of her betrayal and her choice hung between them like a loaded gun. You gonna tell me the whole truth now? Shaq finally asked, voice low, controlled. Sienna exhaled, rubbing her hands over her face. She looked exhausted. I was supposed to bring her back, she admitted, glancing at Aurora. That was my mission. When I first met you, I was already working for Langford. Shaq's grip on the wheel tightened. He should have seen it coming. But then, I saw what they were doing. I saw what Langford was turning them into. Sienna continued, voice hollow. I couldn't go through with it. Aurora finally turned to face her. Her expression was unreadable. So you betrayed them, just like you betrayed us. Sienna flinched. I made my choice. I'm with you now. Shaq let out a long breath. Trust wasn't something he handed out easily, but right now trust didn't matter. Survival did. We need to disappear, he said. For real this time. As the car sped down the empty highway, Shaq's mind raced. Langford was gone, but the experiment wasn't over. The people behind Project Seraphim had endless resources, endless ways to hunt them. Aurora and Elijah weren't just children anymore. They were the key to something much bigger. They'll come after us, Aurora said softly. Shaq glanced at her in the rearview mirror. There was no fear in her voice, only certainty. Sienna nodded grimly. Project Seraphim wasn't just about them. Langford was never the only one pulling the strings. Shaq frowned. Then who was? Sienna swallowed hard. She looked afraid now. I don't know. But someone else did. Miles away, in a darkened surveillance room, a satellite camera locked onto their car. Monitors flickered, showing heat signatures, tracking their every move. The room was lined with high-tech screens, maps, and encrypted data feeds, all feeding into one central command station. A shadowed figure leaned back in his chair, watching the screen with cold, predatory eyes. A voice crackled through the intercom. They survived. The figure didn't move. From the darkness, another voice responded, smooth and emotionless. Proceed with Phase 2. The experiment was far from over. The cabin sat deep in the wilderness, surrounded by towering pines and thick mist that clung to the air like ghosts. It was the kind of place where the world felt far away, where the sky was endless, and silence wrapped around everything like a heavy blanket. Shaq stood outside on the porch, arms crossed, eyes scanning the dark tree line. His gut told him they weren't alone. They never were. Inside, Sienna sat at a wooden table, her laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. She was running encrypted searches, digging into black market intel, trying to find any trace of who was really behind Project Seraphim. Silas, the mysterious defector, had stayed with them, for now. He leaned against the fireplace, watching Aurora as she sat cross-legged on the floor, staring into the flames. She hasn't spoken since we got here, Silas murmured. Shaq glanced at her. Aurora's silver eyes flickered in the dim light, unreadable. She had seen more in 12 years than most people did in a lifetime. She had taken a life, Langford's. And now, she carried that weight in her silence. Baby Elijah lay bundled in blankets nearby, his tiny chest rising and falling. He looked peaceful, but Shaq knew better. His breathing had become irregular. His skin sometimes grew unnaturally cold. Something's happening to him, Shaq muttered. Sienna didn't look up. I know. Shaq tensed. And you didn't think to tell me? Sienna finally met his gaze. Her eyes were tired, filled with something close to fear. Because I don't know what it is, but I think it's accelerating. Shaq clenched his fists. This wasn't over. Silas stepped forward, his face grim. You all need to understand something, he said, his voice steady. Langford was powerful, but he wasn't the top of the chain. The people funding Project Seraphim, they don't lose. Shaq's jaw tightened. Then we make them lose. Silas shook his head. It's not that simple. These aren't just corrupt businessmen or rogue scientists. These are the people who decide which wars get fought, who lives, who dies. People like that don't just stop because one lab went up in flames. Shaq exhaled, running a hand over his face. He knew Silas was right. Destroying the lab hadn't destroyed the program. It had only delayed it. And now, they were being hunted. Aurora finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. We don't run, she said. Not anymore. Shaq looked at her, her hands curled into fists, a flicker of something dangerous in her expression. She had spent her whole life as someone else's experiment. She wasn't going to be a victim anymore. Shaq nodded. Then we fight. Elsewhere, in a secret facility hidden beneath the earth. Rows of flickering monitors cast a dim glow over a sleek, sterile lab. The hum of machinery filled the air as a lone scientist in a white coat walked down the long corridor, past rows of containment chambers. Each chamber held a body, some motionless, others barely breathing. The scientist stopped at the final chamber. Inside, a child sat on a cold metal floor, knees pulled to their chest. Their head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something only they could hear. The scientist tapped on the glass. The child lifted their face, revealing piercing silver eyes just like Aurora's. A slow, eerie smile curled across the child's lips. The scientist turned away, speaking into a communicator. Subject 03 is stable. Proceeding with Phase 3. The screen behind them flickered with one word: awakening. If you were hooked by this intense journey, just know, the story is far from over. Who is the unseen force behind Project Seraphim? What other dark experiments remain hidden? And can Shaq protect the children before the next attack comes? Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and drop a comment. What would you do if you were in Shaq's shoes? Stay tuned for the next thrilling chapter.